Every parent should protect their child, but some fathers become the very danger their daughters need protection from. When 16-year-old Maera's own father drags her to the village square, selling her to the most feared warrior in the kingdom, her world shatters completely. The alpha of the Black Ridge clan is known for his cruelty. Girls sent to his fortress never return. Maera expects torture, hard labor, maybe death. She's been ridiculed her whole life for her size and strong will. Now she's being traded away, like unwanted livestock. But Lord Kael, the scarred war leader who buys her, has given up conquest and bloodshed. In his remote mountain keep, he's planning something nobody could see coming. Instead of breaking her, he wants to give her sanctuary. What could drive a legendary warrior to show mercy to a girl the world threw away? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The village of Thorndale clung to the mountainside like a stubborn scar, its stone houses weathered gray by endless winters and harder hearts. Here, in this forgotten corner of the realm, daughters were measured by their marriage prospects and sons by their strength with a blade. Those who fell short of these narrow measures found little mercy. Maera had learned this truth early and cruelly. At 16, she carried herself with the careful movements of someone who had grown accustomed to taking up too much space in a world that preferred her invisible. Her father's house sat at the village's edge, as if even the buildings knew better than to associate too closely with Gareth the gambler. The morning air bit sharp against her skin as she drew water from the well, her thick woolen dress doing little to ward off the mountain chill. Other girls her age had long since been betrothed or married off, their fathers having secured advantageous matches that brought honor and coin to their families. Maera had received no such offers. Her father made sure she understood why. "Look at you," Gareth would say during his darker moods, when the dice had been particularly unkind. "What man would want such a burden? You eat enough for two and work half as well as your mother did." His words had worn grooves in her spirit deeper than any physical wound. The village square served as the heart of Thorndale's social life, where merchants hawked their meager wares and gossip flowed as freely as ale. But it also served a darker purpose. At its center stood the punishment block, a weathered stone platform where public shamings took place. Maera had witnessed many such spectacles: adulterous wives, thieving children, and daughters who had brought dishonor to their families. She had never imagined she would stand upon it herself. The punishment block had seen generations of suffering, its surface worn smooth by countless tears and the weight of broken spirits. Village elders claimed it had been carved from a single stone by the first settlers, blessed by priests to ensure justice would always prevail. To Maera, it looked more like an altar of cruelty. Her father's gambling debts had grown like a cancer, spreading through their small household until nothing remained untouched. First, he had sold her mother's jewelry, the few precious pieces passed down through generations. Then came the furniture, the tools, even the winter stores of grain. Each loss brought fresh shame, but Gareth always promised the next game would turn their fortunes around. It never did. The villagers had long since stopped extending credit to Gareth. His reputation as a man who couldn't honor his word had spread like wildfire through the tight-knit community. Shopkeepers turned him away. Farmers refused his promises of future payment. And even the tavern keeper had banned him from the dice games that had become his obsession. But Gareth had one asset left, one thing of value that could satisfy his creditors and buy him a fresh start. His daughter. Maera first learned of her fate 3 days before it happened. She had returned from the baker's shop, where she sometimes helped knead dough in exchange for day-old bread, to find her father pacing their small kitchen like a caged wolf. His eyes held a wild light she had come to associate with his worst decisions. "You should be grateful," he said without preamble. not even looking at her directly. "Lord Aldrich has agreed to forget my debts in exchange for you. It's more generosity than either of us deserves." Lord Aldrich was a minor noble from a neighboring village, a man in his 50s known for his cruelty to servants and his collection of young wives, who had an unfortunate tendency to die in accidents. The thought of belonging to such a man made Maera's stomach turn, but she had learned long ago that her opinions mattered little in her father's calculations. "When?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "3 days hence. The transaction will be public, as is proper. Lord Aldrich wants to ensure there can be no question of legitimacy." Gareth finally met her eyes, and for a moment, she thought, she saw a flicker of regret. But it vanished so quickly, she might have imagined it. Those 3 days passed like a fevered dream. Maera tried to prepare herself for whatever fate awaited her in Lord Aldrich's household, packing her few possessions into a small satchel. She owned little of value, some worn clothing, a hair ribbon her mother had given her, and a small knife her grandmother had pressed into her hands years ago, with mysterious words about protection. The villagers spoke in hushed tones about her impending sale, some expressing pity, others claiming she had brought it upon herself through some failing of character. A few of the older women tried to offer advice about surviving in a nobleman's house, but their words felt hollow and distant. On the morning of the 3rd day, her father woke her before dawn. "Get dressed in your best dress," he commanded. "Today, you begin a new life." Maera's best dress was a faded blue woolen garment that had once belonged to her mother. It fit poorly, straining at the seams, but it was the finest thing she owned. She braided her dark hair carefully and tried to compose herself for whatever ordeal awaited. The walk to the village square felt like a funeral procession. Gareth walked several paces ahead, unable or unwilling to meet her eyes. Villagers had already begun to gather, drawn by the prospect of witnessing such an unusual transaction. Daughters were typically married off in private ceremonies, not sold like livestock in public squares. But then, Maera had always been different. The crowd parted as they approached the punishment block, creating a corridor of staring faces and whispered judgments. Maera kept her head high, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She had endured their mockery for years. She would not crumble now. Elder Dunstan, the village's unofficial leader, stood beside the block with a scroll in his weathered hands. His face bore the stern expression of a man performing an unpleasant but necessary duty. Behind him stood Lord Aldrich, a thin man with pale eyes and hands that seemed too soft for honest work. "Before we proceed," Elder Dunstan announced in his carrying voice, "let it be known that this transaction is conducted in accordance with ancient law. Gareth of Thorndale, having incurred debts beyond his ability to repay, offers his daughter Maera in settlement to Lord Aldrich of Westmere." Maera felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her as she stepped onto the punishment block. The stone felt cold beneath her feet, and she could see dark stains that no amount of scrubbing had been able to remove. She wondered how many others had stood here before her, facing their own moments of ultimate vulnerability. But as Elder Dunstan prepared to formalize the transaction, a commotion arose at the edge of the square. The crowd began to murmur and shift, parting once again to allow passage to a new arrival. Maera turned to see what had captured their attention and felt her blood turn to ice. Lord Kael of the Black Ridge had come to Thorndale. Even those who had never seen him before knew him instantly. The alpha of the northern clans carried himself with the bearing of a man who had commanded armies and conquered kingdoms. Tall and broad-shouldered, he wore simple traveling clothes that nonetheless couldn't disguise the deadly grace with which he moved. A scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, a pale line that spoke of battles fought and survived. But it was his eyes that truly marked him, as dangerous gray as winter storms and just as unpredictable. They swept over the assembled crowd with casual assessment before settling on the scene at the punishment block. The villagers pressed back against the buildings, giving the legendary warrior a wide berth. Children who had been running underfoot moments before now clung to their mother's skirts. Even the dogs seemed to sense something primal and threatening about this man and slunk away to hide. Lord Aldrich's pale complexion went even whiter as he recognized the newcomer. Everyone in the region knew the stories of Lord Kael's conquests, his strategic brilliance, and his complete ruthlessness in dealing with enemies. What none could understand was why such a man would interest himself in the affairs of a poor mountain village. Lord Kael, Elder Dunstan managed, his voice cracking slightly. "We are honored by your presence, though I fear our humble proceedings are hardly worthy of your attention." The Alpha's gaze remained fixed on Maera, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. She forced herself to meet his eyes, though every instinct screamed at her to look away. There was something in his expression she couldn't read, not cruelty, as she had expected, but something else entirely. "I have need of a healer for my household," Lord Kael said, his voice carrying easily across the now silent square. "I understand there is a young woman here with such potential." Maera's heart lurched. A healer? She had never shown any particular aptitude for medicine, though her grandmother had taught her a few simple remedies before her death years ago. She couldn't imagine why the feared Alpha would think she possessed such skills. Lord Aldrich stepped forward, his merchant's instincts overriding his fear. "My lord, I'm afraid there has been some misunderstanding. This girl has already been promised to me in settlement of debts. The transaction is nearly complete." Kael's cold gaze shifted to the pale nobleman, and Aldrich actually took a step backward. "I see. And what sum was agreed upon?" 50 silver pieces, my lord," Aldrich replied, his voice barely steady. Without hesitation, Kael reached into a leather pouch at his belt and produced a handful of coins that glinted gold in the morning sunlight. He placed them on the punishment block with deliberate precision. 100 gold pieces. "I trust this settles any prior arrangements," the crowd gasped collectively. The sum represented more wealth than most of them would see in a lifetime. Gareth's eyes went wide with greed and shock, while Lord Aldrich's face cycled through emotions too quickly to follow. "My lord," Aldrich began again, "surely we can reach some accommodation. Can we?" Kael's hand moved almost casually to rest on the pommel of his sword. The gesture was subtle, but its meaning was unmistakable. "I find myself growing impatient with negotiations." Elder Dunstan, recognizing the dangerous turn the situation had taken, quickly intervened. "Lord Kael's offer is most generous. Gareth, do you accept these terms?" Her father nodded so vigorously that Maera feared his head might detach from his neck. Yes, of course. The debt is settled. The girl is yours, my lord." And just like that, her fate was decided. Not by Lord Aldrich, as she had feared, but by a man whose reputation for ruthlessness exceeded even her worst nightmares. She had gone from the frying pan into the fire, and there was nothing she could do to change it. Lord Kael gathered the coins he had placed on the block and handed them to her father, who received them with shaking hands. Then the Alpha turned his attention back to Maera. "Gather your belongings," he said simply. "We leave within the hour." As the crowd began to disperse, chattering excitedly about what they had witnessed, Maera stood frozen on the punishment block. The morning that had begun with the certainty of one terrible fate had ended with another that might prove even worse. She had been saved from Lord Aldrich's cruelty, only to be claimed by a man whose very name was synonymous with death and destruction. But as she looked into Lord Kael's storm-gray eyes, she saw something that puzzled her. Where she had expected to find coldness or cruelty, she instead glimpsed what might have been understanding. It was gone so quickly she might have imagined it, but the possibility left her more confused than ever. What could the Alpha of the Black Ridge possibly want with a girl like her? The hour Lord Kael had given her felt both endless and impossibly brief. Maera hurried through the village streets one final time, acutely aware of the stares that followed her every step. Word of her sale to the legendary Alpha had spread faster than wildfire, and she could feel the weight of every gaze some pitying, others envious, most simply curious about what would become of Gareth's daughter. Her small room felt even smaller as she gathered her meager possessions. The worn clothing, her mother's hair ribbon, her grandmother's knife, everything that remained of her life, fit easily into a single canvas satchel. As she folded her few dresses, her fingers trembled with a mixture of fear and something else she couldn't quite name. Relief, perhaps, at escaping Lord Aldrich's fate, though she suspected Lord Kael's intentions might prove far worse. The knock on her door came sooner than expected. She opened it to find not Lord Kael himself, but a woman she had never seen before. Tall and lean, with graying hair pulled back in a practical braid, the stranger wore traveling clothes of fine quality but simple design. Her weathered hands and steady gaze spoke of someone accustomed to hard work and harder decisions. "I am Maera," the woman said without preamble, "Lord Kael's housekeeper. He sent me to escort you to the horses." Maera shouldered her satchel and followed Maera through the village streets, noting how even this unknown woman commanded a subtle respect from the villagers they passed. Everything associated with Lord Kael seemed to carry an aura of power and danger. At the village's edge, 3 horses waited, 2 sturdy mounts, and a magnificent black stallion that could only belong to the Alpha himself. Lord Kael stood beside the animals, checking their gear with the methodical precision of a man who had spent years ensuring that small details could mean the difference between life and death. He had changed from his travel clothes into black leather and wool that seemed to absorb the morning light. A sword hung at his side, its plain leather scabbard giving no hint of the deadly steel within. When he looked up at their approach, his gray eyes held the same unreadable expression that had puzzled her in the square. "Can you ride?" he asked. Without preamble, Maera nodded, though it was something of an exaggeration. She had ridden the old plow horse a few times, but nothing that could properly be called horsemanship. Still, she sensed that admitting weakness might not be wise. Lord Kael studied her for a moment, then gestured to the smaller of the 2 horses, a gentle-looking Maera with kind eyes. "Sarah will not give you trouble. Keep her close to Maera's mount." As they prepared to depart, Maera became aware of the silver coin that Lord Kael casually tossed between his fingers, the same coin that had sealed her fate, transforming her from daughter to property in the space of a heartbeat. The metal caught the sunlight as it spun, winking like a cold star before disappearing back into his palm. The sight of that coin drove home the reality of her situation more forcefully than anything else. She was no longer Maera of Thorndale, no longer even Gareth's daughter. She belonged to Lord Kael now, as surely as his horse or his sword. The coin was proof of purchase, a silver symbol of her new status as property. Her father had emerged from their house to watch their departure, the weight of his newfound gold evident in the way he stood straighter than she had seen in years. He raised a hand in what might have been farewell or blessing, but made no move to approach. Perhaps he feared that coming too close might somehow undo the transaction that had freed him from debt. Maer climbed onto Sarah's back with as much dignity as she could manage, grateful when the Mari stood patiently despite her clumsy mounting. The village spread out below them as they began their ascent into the mountains, looking smaller and more insignificant with each step. She had lived her entire life within sight of those buildings, and now she was leaving them forever. The initial part of their journey passed in silence, broken only by the steady rhythm of hoofbeats on stone and the occasional creak of leather. Lord Kael rode ahead, his attention apparently focused on the treacherous mountain path, while Maera kept pace beside Maera. The older woman's presence was oddly comforting, a Connor Capapay a demonic female face in what promised to be a very masculine world. As they climbed higher, the familiar landscape of Maera's childhood gave way to territory she had only glimpsed from a distance. Ancient pines clung to impossible slopes, their roots finding purchase in cracks between massive boulders. The air grew thinner and colder, carrying scents of snow and stone and something wilder that spoke of places where human influence held little sway. "You're afraid," Maera observed after they had ridden for perhaps an hour. It wasn't a question, and Maera saw little point in denying it. "Shouldn't I be?" "Fear can be wisdom," the older woman replied. "Or it can be folly. Which it proves to be depends largely on what you do with it." "What happened to the last girl he brought to the fortress?" Maera asked, the question escaping before she could stop herself. Maera's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. "There was no last girl. You are the first." This information should have been reassuring, but somehow it only made Maera more nervous. If Lord Kael had never brought women to his fortress before, what had changed? What made her different, or valuable, or necessary enough to break his apparent pattern? They paused at midday to rest the horses and share a simple meal of bread and dried meat. Lord Kael remained distant, checking their supplies and studying the path ahead with the intensity of a man who trusted nothing to chance. When he spoke, it was to Maera about practical matters: the condition of the animals, the weather, the estimated time to reach the fortress. Maera found herself studying him when she thought he wasn't looking, trying to reconcile the legendary warrior with the man who had chosen kindness over expedience in purchasing her freedom from Lord Aldrich. The scar that marked his face was old and well-healed, but it spoke of violence endured and survived. His hands, she noticed, bore the calluses of sword work and the small scars that came from a lifetime of handling weapons. Yet those same hands had been gentle when helping her mount her horse, and his voice, though commanding, held none of the cruelty she had expected. "Lord Kael," she said during a moment when Maera had stepped away to tend to something, "may I ask why you chose me?" He looked at her with those storm-gray eyes, and for a long moment she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words were carefully measured. "Sometimes we see potential where others see only burden," he said. "Time will tell whether my judgment was sound." The answer told her nothing and everything at once. He had seen something in her that she didn't even see in herself, something that had made her worth 100 gold pieces to a man who commanded armies. The thought was both terrifying and oddly exhilarating. As the afternoon wore on, the landscape grew ever more rugged and remote. They passed no other travelers, saw no signs of human habitation save for the occasional shepherd's hut built into the shelter of an overhanging rock. This was wild country, the kind of place where wolves still hunted and bears denned through the harsh winters. The path they followed was clearly ancient, worn smooth by countless generations of feet and hooves, but it was narrow and treacherous. In places, it hugged cliff faces where a single misstep would mean a fall of hundreds of feet onto jagged rocks below. Maera found herself leaning away from the drop-offs, trusting Sarah's mountain-bred sure-footedness more than her own inexperience. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, casting long shadows across the mountainsides, Lord Kael called a halt. "We'll reach the fortress before darkness," he announced. "From here, you can see your new home." He pointed ahead to where the path curved around a massive granite outcropping. Following his gesture, Maera caught her first glimpse of Black Ridge Fortress and felt her breath catch in her throat. The structure seemed to grow from the mountain itself, its dark stone walls rising seamlessly from the cliff face on which it stood. Towers soared impossibly high, their banners snapping in the mountain wind like captured storms. Even from this distance, she could see the fortress was massive, easily 10 times the size of Thorndale Village and infinitely more imposing. But What struck her most was not its size or its obviously formidable defenses. It was the sense of permanence it conveyed, as if it had always been part of the mountain and always would be. This was no temporary structure built for convenience. It was a statement carved in stone, a declaration that its builders intended to endure. "It's magnificent," she breathed, then immediately worried that such honesty might be inappropriate. Lord Kael's expression remained unreadable, but something in his posture suggested her words had pleased him. "It has stood for 3 centuries," he said. "My ancestors built it to last." As they resumed their journey toward the fortress, Maera found herself wondering what her place would be in such an ancient and imposing structure. Lord Kael had spoken of needing a healer, but she possessed no real training in such arts. Her grandmother had taught her to prepare simple remedies for common ailments, but nothing that would justify the confidence he seemed to place in her abilities. The closer they drew to the fortress, the more questions multiplied in her mind. Why had he really chosen her? What did he expect from her? And perhaps most importantly, what would happen if she failed to meet whatever expectations he harbored? The silver coin that had sealed her fate continued to catch the light as Lord Kael absently worked it between his fingers, a constant reminder that her life had been purchased, not freely given. Yet something in his manner suggested that the transaction in the village square had been less about acquisition than about rescue. She could only hope that her judgment of his character proved more accurate than her father's judgment of dice and cards. Her life, quite literally, depended on it. The final approach to Black Ridge Fortress proved even more breathtaking than Maera had imagined. The ancient structure seemed to emerge from the mountain itself, its dark towers reaching toward clouds that gathered perpetually around the highest peaks. A narrow causeway carved from living rock provided the only access, with a drop of several hundred feet on either side that made her grateful for Sarah's steady gate. Guards in black leather and mail watched their approach from the gatehouse, but they offered respectful salutes rather than challenges. Clearly, Lord Kael's return had been expected and welcomed. The massive oak gate swung open without command, revealing a courtyard larger than Thorndale's entire village square. As they passed beneath the portcullis, Maera caught sight of the fortress's true scale. What had appeared imposing from a distance proved overwhelming up close. The walls rose like cliffs on all sides, dotted with narrow windows that glowed warmly in the gathering dusk. Smoke from numerous chimneys spoke of a large household, while the sounds of activity, voices calling, horses nickering, the ring of hammer on anvil suggested a community rather than merely a military outpost. Lord Kael dismounted with fluid grace and handed his stallion's reins to a waiting groom who appeared immediately at his side. The young man's respectful demeanor spoke of genuine loyalty rather than mere duty, another small puzzle in the growing mystery of her new master's character. "Welcome to Black Ridge," Lord Kael said as he helped Maera down from Sarah's back. His touch was brief and impersonal, but she noticed the careful way he steadied her until she found her footing on the cobblestones. Maera began issuing quiet instructions to various servants who had materialized as if summoned by magic. Maera's small satchel was taken by a young woman with a kind face, while another servant led the horses toward what appeared to be extensive stables built into the eastern wall. The efficiency was remarkable. Within moments, all evidence of their arrival had been cleared away save for the 3 travel-weary riders themselves. "You must be hungry," Lord Kael observed, studying Maera's face with that same unreadable expression she was beginning to recognize. "And tired from the journey. Maera will see you to quarters where you can rest and refresh yourself. We'll speak again tomorrow." Before Maera could frame a response, he was striding away across the courtyard with the purposeful gait of a man with important matters awaiting his attention. She watched him go, noting how various fortress inhabitants paused in their tasks to offer respectful greetings that he acknowledged with brief nods. "Come," Maera said, touching her elbow gently. "Let me show you to your room." They entered the fortress through a doorway that opened onto a corridor wide enough for 6 people to walk abreast. The walls were dressed stone, smooth and precisely fitted, with thick tapestries providing both warmth and beauty. Torches in iron sconces cast dancing shadows that made the woven scenes seem to move with lives of their own. But it was the atmosphere that struck Maera most forcefully. She had expected the cold, harsh environment that matched Lord Kael's fearsome reputation. Instead, the fortress felt lived in and welcoming, more like a great house than a military stronghold. The sense of cooking food and wood smoke mixed with something sweeter, perhaps dried herbs or flowers, creating an almost homely warmth. "You seem surprised," Maera observed as they climbed a spiral staircase whose worn steps spoke of centuries of use. "I expected something different," Maera admitted. "More like a prison, perhaps." "Black Ridge has served many purposes over the years," Maera replied. "Fortress, stronghold, seat of power. But Lord Kael has made it something new. A sanctuary of sorts." They paused on a landing lit by tall windows that offered stunning views of the mountain valley spread below. Even in the growing darkness, Maera could make out the silver thread of a river winding between dark peaks. It was beautiful in a wild, untamed way that spoke to something deep in her spirit. The room Maera led her to was unlike anything Maera had ever seen. Larger than her father's entire house, it featured a real bed with thick blankets and embroidered coverlets, a writing desk positioned near the window, and most remarkably, its own fireplace where flames already danced cheerfully. Her satchel sat on a wooden chest at the foot of the bed, looking pitifully small in such grand surroundings. "This is mine?" Maera asked, unable to keep the wonder from her voice. "Lord Kael's instructions were quite specific," Maera replied with what might have been the hint of a smile. "You are to be treated as an honored guest, not a servant. Though I suspect you'll find ways to make yourself useful soon enough." A wooden tub had been placed before the fireplace, already filled with steaming water that released the scent of lavender and other herbs. Clean clothes lay folded on the bed, simple but well-made garments in shades of brown and green that would suit her coloring far better than her faded blue dress. Around her neck, Maera fastened a pendant that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. The stone was a deep green color, set in silver that felt warm against her skin. Ancient symbols were etched around its border, though Maera couldn't read their meaning. "What is this?" she asked, touching the pendant with careful fingers. "A healer's pendant," Maera replied. "It has been in Lord Kael's family for generations, waiting for someone worthy to wear it. He believes that someone is you." The weight of that expectation settled on Maera's shoulders like a heavy cloak. "But I'm not a healer. I know a few simple remedies my grandmother taught me, but nothing more. What if he's made a mistake?" "Lord Kael rarely makes mistakes about people," Maera said with quiet confidence. "Trust his judgment, even if you cannot yet trust your own." After Maera left her alone, Maera sank into the hot bath with a sigh of pure pleasure. The water eased aches she hadn't even realized she carried, while the herbs soothed her travel-worn skin. As she soaked, she tried to process the bewildering turn her life had taken. This morning, she had been Gareth's unwanted daughter, destined for a cruel fate in Lord Aldrich's household. Tonight, she sat in luxury that surpassed anything she had ever dreamed possible, wearing a pendant that marked her as something she wasn't sure she could become. The pendant seemed to grow warmer against her skin as she held it, and for a moment, she could have sworn she felt something stirring within the stone, a gentle pulse like a sleeping heartbeat. But when she looked closely, it appeared nothing more than an ancient piece of jewelry, beautiful but ordinary dot after bathing and dressing in the clothes provided for her. Maera sat by the window and watched the stars emerge over the mountain peaks. The fortress grew quiet around her as its inhabitants settled into their evening routines. But she could still hear distant sounds of activity guards walking their rounds, perhaps, or late workers finishing their tasks. A soft knock interrupted her contemplation. At her invitation, a young servant entered bearing a tray of food that made her mouth water instantly. Roasted meat, fresh bread, vegetables she couldn't identify, and a cup of something that steamed invitingly. After years of her father's meager table, such abundance seemed almost sinful. "Lord Kael's compliments," the servant said with a respectful curtsy. "He hopes you find everything to your liking." As Maera ate, she found herself thinking about the man who had so unexpectedly changed her fate. Everything about him seemed to contradict his fearsome reputation. The kindness he had shown in rescuing her from Lord Aldrich, the luxury of her accommodations, the respectful treatment from his servants, none of it matched the stories of the ruthless Alpha who had conquered half the northern territories. Yet she had seen the sword at his side, the scars that marked his face and hands, the way hardened warriors deferred to his authority. The capacity for violence was clearly there, carefully controlled but unmistakably present. Perhaps the key to understanding Lord Kael lay in recognizing that a man could be both gentle and dangerous, protective and deadly, depending on circumstances and need. The pendant continued to pulse gently against her skin, a constant reminder of expectations she wasn't sure she could fulfill. But as she settled into the comfortable bed and pulled the warm blankets around her, Maera found herself thinking that perhaps, for the first time in her life, someone believed she might be capable of more than she had ever imagined. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and revelations, she was certain. Tonight, however, she was safe, warm, and fed luxuries that had been strangers to her for far too long. Whatever Lord Kael's true intentions, whatever role he expected her to play, she would face it from a position of strength rather than desperation. The thought was both terrifying and oddly liberating. For better or worse, her old life was over. What remained to be seen was what kind of new life she might build in its place. Dawn came early in the mountains, streaming through the tall windows of Maera's chamber with golden light that painted the stone walls in warm hues. She had slept better than she had in years, the combination of exhaustion and unexpected comfort lulling her into dreams that were blessedly free of anxiety. A gentle knock woke her fully, and Maera entered bearing another tray of food, fresh bread, honey, eggs, and fruit that must have cost a fortune to transport to such a remote location. The older woman's expression held a mixture of curiosity and approval as she studied Maera's face. "You look rested," she observed. "Good. Lord Kael wishes to see you after you've broken your fast. There are things you need to understand about your role here." The chamber key Maera placed in her hands was made of brass that had been worn smooth by countless fingers, etched with symbols that matched those on her pendant. It was heavier than it looked, substantial in a way that spoke of importance beyond its practical function. "What does this unlock?" Maera asked, turning the key over in her palm. "The healing chambers," Maera replied. "They've stood empty for too long. Lord Kael believes it's time they served their proper purpose again." After Maera departed, Maera dressed carefully in the clothes provided for her. The green woolen dress fit her properly, the first garment she had worn in years that didn't strain at the seams or hang loose in uncomfortable places. Someone had taken considerable care to ensure her comfort. Another small kindness that didn't align with Lord Kael's reputation for ruthlessness. She found him in what appeared to be a study, surrounded by books, maps, and correspondence that spoke of the complex business of managing both a fortress and the broader territories under his control. He looked up from a letter he was reading as she entered, gesturing for her to take a seat in the chair across from his desk. "I trust you slept well?" he asked, setting aside his correspondence. "Better than I have in years, my lord. I wanted to thank you." He raised a hand to stop her words. Thanks are unnecessary. You're here because I believe you can serve a purpose that benefits us both. Tell me, what do you know of healing? Maera shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Very little, I'm afraid. My grandmother taught me to prepare simple remedies, willow bark tea for pain, honey and herbs for coughs, how to clean and bind wounds. Nothing that would qualify as true healing arts. Yet you wear the pendant, he observed, nodding toward the green stone that rested against her throat. Tell me how it feels. The question was odd enough that she paused to consider it seriously. The pendant did feel different from ordinary jewelry warmer, somehow as if it possessed a life of its own. When she concentrated on it, she could sense something stirring within the stone, a gentle pulse that seemed to respond to her attention. Warm, she said finally, as if it were alive. Lord Kael nodded, as if her answer confirmed something he had already suspected. The pendant has been in my family for 7 generations, passed down through the bloodline of the original guardians of these mountains. It has never responded to anyone until now. He rose from his chair and moved to stand beside one of the tall windows, gazing out at the mountain peaks that surrounded his fortress. My ancestors believed that some people are born with an innate connection to the healing arts, a gift that sleeps until awakened by need and opportunity. The pendant serves as both key and test. It will only accept someone with genuine potential. But I've never shown any such gifts, Maera protested. Surely there's been some mistake, have you not? Lord Kael turned back to face her, his gray eyes thoughtful. Think carefully. Have there been times when your touch seemed to ease pain? When plants flourished under your care? When you seemed to know things about illness or injury that you had never been taught? As he spoke, memories began to surface, half-forgotten moments that had seemed insignificant at the time. The neighbor's child, whose fever had broken after she held his hand. The way her grandmother's herb garden had thrived under her care, producing yields that amazed the older woman. The instinctive knowledge that had guided her when treating her father's occasional injuries, choosing remedies she had never seen prepared. Perhaps, she admitted slowly, there were incidents, but I thought them mere coincidence. In my experience, coincidence is often simply pattern we haven't yet learned to recognize. Lord Kael returned to his seat, his expression growing more serious. I brought you here because Black Ridge has need of a healer, but more than that. I believe you have need of a place where your gifts can grow without judgment or restriction. The weight of his words settled over her like a mantle. He was offering her more than shelter or even purpose. He was offering her the chance to become something she had never dared imagine herself capable of being. Why? She asked. Why invest such faith in someone you barely know? Because I understand what it means to be underestimated, he replied simply. To have others see only weakness where strength lies hidden. My own path to leadership was unconventional. Many believed a scarred warrior could never command loyalty through anything but fear. They were wrong. There was something in his tone that spoke of old pain, old struggles against expectations and limitations imposed by others. Maera found herself studying his face with new eyes, seeing not just a legendary alpha, but a man who had faced his own doubts and emerged stronger for the experience. The fortress has healing chambers that have stood empty since my grandmother's death, he continued. She was the last true healer to serve Black Ridge, and her loss left a void that has never been properly filled. I believe you can change that, given time and proper guidance. He moved to a cabinet along the wall and withdrew a leather-bound book whose pages were yellow with age. This belonged to my grandmother. Her journal, containing everything she learned about the healing arts during her 60 years of practice. Study it, learn from it, but more importantly, trust your instincts to guide you beyond what any book can teach. Maera accepted the journal with reverent hands, feeling the weight of generations of knowledge within its worn covers. The leather was soft with age and handling, marked with stains that spoke of years spent in active use rather than sitting forgotten on a shelf. "I don't know if I can live up to such expectations," she said honestly. "Then you're already wiser than most," Lord Kael replied with what might have been the hint of a smile. "Wisdom begins with understanding the limits of our knowledge. What matters is your willingness to learn and grow." He stood and moved toward the door, then paused to look back at her. "Maera will show you to the healing chambers when you're ready. Take whatever time you need to familiarize yourself with the space and the resources available. There's no pressure to begin immediately. Healing is not a skill that can be rushed." After he left, Maera sat alone in the study, holding her grandmother's journal and trying to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. Lord Kael hadn't simply offered her sanctuary from her previous fate. He had offered her a chance to discover abilities she had never known she possessed, to become someone worthy of the trust he was placing in her. The pendant pulsed gently against her skin, as if responding to her thoughts and emotions. For the first time since her father had announced her sale, she felt something other than fear about her future. Hope, perhaps, or at least curiosity about what she might become in this strange new life. The chamber key felt heavy in her hand as she rose to leave the study, its brass surface warm from her grip. Whatever lay beyond the door it would unlock. She knew there would be no going back to the girl she had been. That frightened and ashamed daughter of Gareth the gambler was gone forever. What remained to be seen was who would take her place. The healing chambers lay in the oldest part of the fortress, reached through corridors whose stones bore the marks of centuries. Maera led Maera through passages lit by torches that cast dancing shadows on walls, decorated with faded tapestries depicting scenes of herb gathering and healing rituals. These chambers were built when the fortress was first established, Maera explained as they walked. The original lords understood that a stronghold's strength lay not just in its walls and weapons, but in its ability to heal and preserve life. The brass key turned smoothly in an ancient lock, and the heavy oak door swung open to reveal chambers that took Maera's breath away. The main room was circular, with tall windows positioned to catch the morning light and shelves that reached from floor to ceiling. Every surface was designed for the storage and preparation of healing supplies: marble counters for grinding herbs, copper vessels for heating water, glass containers for storing delicate preparations. But it was the books that truly amazed her. Hundreds of volumes lined the shelves, their leather bindings bearing titles in languages she couldn't read. These were the accumulated knowledge of generations of healers, collected from across the known world and preserved in this mountain sanctuary. Ancient healing texts surrounded her like silent teachers, their pages filled with wisdom she could barely comprehend. Some were written in the common tongue, but others bore scripts that looked like art more than writing. Diagrams showed the human body in ways she had never imagined, while detailed illustrations depicted plants she had never seen. Lord Kael's ancestors were great collectors of knowledge, Maera observed, watching Mara's amazed expression. They understood that healing requires both intuition and learning, both natural gift and trained skill. One book lay open on the central table, its pages filled with careful notes in a feminine hand. This must be the working journal of Lord Kael's grandmother, the last healer to use these chambers. Her annotations filled the margins, adding personal observations to the ancient wisdom contained in the formal text. She was remarkable, Maera said softly, noting where Maera's attention had focused. Lady Alara could heal wounds that others declared mortal, ease pain that had tormented people for years. The people of these mountains still speak of her with reverence. Maera ran her fingers over the open pages, feeling the weight of expectations settling on her shoulders once again. How could she possibly fill the role of someone so gifted, so accomplished? The very idea seemed presumptuous beyond belief. "I can see your doubt," Maera said gently. "Lady Alara felt the same way when she first came to these chambers. She was barely older than you, married to Lord Kael's grandfather as part of a political alliance. She had no training, no confidence, only a gift she didn't understand. What changed? Maera asked. Time, practice, and most importantly, the understanding. That healing is not about perfection. It's about compassion guided by knowledge and sharpened by experience. They spent the morning exploring the chambers, with Maera explaining the purpose of various tools and ingredients. Some things were familiar from her grandmother's simple remedies: willow bark, honey, common herbs for teas and poultices. Others were exotic substances with properties she could only guess at in one alcove. They discovered a workshop where dried herbs hung in carefully arranged bundles. The scents were overwhelming at first: bitter, sweet, sharp, earthy, creating a complex symphony that spoke of healing possibilities she was only beginning to understand. Lady Alara's garden still grows beyond the western wall, Maera mentioned as they examined the dried stores. Perhaps you'd like to see it this afternoon? The garden proved to be another revelation. Despite years of minimal tending, many of the healing plants had survived and even thrived in the mountain air. Maera found herself drawn to certain specimens, her hands seeming to know which plants needed attention and which were flourishing on their own as she knelt beside a patch of feverfew. Examining its delicate white flowers, she became aware of a strange sensation. The pendant around her neck grew warm, and she could have sworn she felt something flowing between her hands and the plant, a gentle energy that seemed to encourage growth and health. Interesting, came Lord Kael's voice from behind her. She turned to find him watching from the garden entrance, his expression thoughtful. How long he had been there, she couldn't say, but something in his eyes suggested he had witnessed her unusual connection with the plants. The feverfew was dying when we found it, he said, approaching slowly. Lady Alara's favorite for treating headaches and women's ailments. Maera and I had nearly given up hope of saving it. Maera looked back at the plant in her hands. It did seem healthier than the surrounding vegetation, its leaves greener and its flowers more abundant. But surely that was simply coincidence, or perhaps the result of whatever care Maera had been providing. Plants respond to attention, she said, trying to dismiss the strange sensation she had felt. Some do, Lord Kael agreed, but not usually so dramatically or so quickly. They walked together through the garden, with Lord Kael pointing out various plants and sharing what he remembered of his grandmother's teachings about their uses. His knowledge was surprisingly extensive for a warrior, though he was quick to acknowledge the limitations of second-hand learning. I was her assistant sometimes as a child, he explained when Maera commented on his familiarity with the herbs. She believed everyone should understand the basics of healing, especially those who might find themselves responsible for others' welfare. As they talked, Maera found herself relaxing in his presence, away from the formal setting of his study. Lord Kael seemed less intimidating and more approachable. His passion for the healing arts was genuine, driven not by academic interest, but by a deep understanding of their importance to his people's welfare. "May I ask you something?" she said, as they paused beside a patch of mint that released its fresh scent when disturbed. "Of course. Why did you really abandon conquest? The stories say you were one of the most successful military leaders of your generation. What made you choose a different path?" Lord Kael was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the mountain peaks visible beyond the garden walls. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of painful memory. "Success in war is measured by victories won and enemies defeated," he said slowly. "But victory always comes at a cost, and that cost is usually paid by people who never chose to fight at all. I grew tired of counting triumphs in blood and suffering." He gestured toward the fortress walls, where she could see people going about their daily tasks in apparent contentment. Here, success can be measured differently. In crops that thrive, children who grow healthy and strong, old people who live their final years in comfort and dignity. These victories seem more worthwhile than any I achieved with sword and strategy. There was something deeply moving about his words, a sincerity that spoke of a man who had genuinely reevaluated his priorities and chosen a harder but more meaningful path. Maera found herself thinking that perhaps the stories about Lord Kael had missed the most important part of his character, not his capacity for destruction, but his wisdom to choose creation instead. The healing chambers are part of that vision, he continued. A place where suffering can be eased rather than inflicted, where knowledge serves life rather than death. I hope you'll help me fulfill that purpose. As they returned to the fortress, Maera carried with her a new understanding of both her role and the man who had chosen her for it. Lord Kael wasn't simply seeking a replacement for his grandmother's skills. He was trying to build something entirely new, a community where strength was measured by care rather than conquest. The weight of responsibility felt different now, less like burden and more like opportunity. Perhaps she couldn't become Lady Alara, but she could become herself, whatever that might prove to be. The ancient texts awaited her study, filled with centuries of accumulated wisdom. But more importantly, the plants in the garden responded to her touch in ways that suggested her gifts, whatever their true nature, were real and growing stronger. Tomorrow would bring new lessons, new challenges, new opportunities to understand the extent of her abilities. Tonight she would begin reading Lady Alara's journal, seeking guidance from a woman who had walked this path before her. The pendant pulsed gently against her skin as she settled into her comfortable chair by the window, the ancient book open in her lap. Whatever lay ahead, she no longer faced it alone. 3 weeks passed in a blur of discovery and learning that left Maera feeling as though she had awakened from a long dream into a life she had never dared imagine. Each morning brought new lessons in the healing chambers. Each afternoon saw her working Lady Alara's garden, and each evening found her poring over ancient texts by candlelight. Her progress surprised even Maera, who had seen many attempt to master the healing arts with far less success. Plants seemed to flourish under Maera's care with an enthusiasm that defied the approaching mountain winter. More remarkably, her first attempts at treating minor ailments among the fortress inhabitants had shown results that bordered on miraculous. When young Thomas, a stable boy, suffered a severe burn from a mishap with hot oil, Maera's poultice had healed the wound in days rather than weeks. An elderly cook's chronic joint pain had eased after drinking teas prepared according to Maera's instinctive modifications of traditional recipes. Word of her growing abilities spread through the fortress like wildfire, bringing a steady stream of people seeking her help. The intercepted message arrived on a gray morning when early snow dusted the mountain peaks like powdered sugar. Lord Kael had been reading correspondence in his study when Captain Marcus burst in without ceremony, his weathered face grim with concern. Maera happened to be present, consulting with Lord Kael about expanding the herb gardens before winter set in completely. She watched as he read the parchment Marcus handed him, noting how his expression hardened with each line. "What is it?" she asked, though she feared she already knew from the captain's agitation. "Lord Aldrich has been busy," Lord Kael said, his voice carefully controlled. "It seems my purchase of your freedom has been interpreted as a sign of weakness by certain neighboring lords." He handed her the message, which bore the seal of Lord Rowan of Greystone Keep, one of the most powerful nobles in the region. The words were formally polite but carried an unmistakable threat beneath their diplomatic language. The letter suggested that Lord Kael's recent softness had been noted with concern by his fellow lords, who wondered if the feared Alpha had perhaps lost his edge. There were hints about the wisdom of maintaining traditional strengths, and veiled references to the unfortunate consequences that might befall those who show too much mercy. "They think your kindness makes you vulnerable," Maera said, understanding immediately. "More than that, Captain Marcus interjected. Our scouts report increased activity around Greystone Keep. Lord Rowan has been hosting gatherings of Maera lords, and there's talk of a coalition forming. Lord Kael moved to stand beside the window, gazing out at his peaceful courtyard where people went about their daily tasks in blissful ignorance of the growing threat. They see change as weakness, because they cannot imagine strength that doesn't rely on fear and cruelty. "What will you do?" Maera asked, though she dreaded the answer. "What I must," he replied simply, "but not what they expect." Over the following days, the fortress began subtle preparations for potential conflict. Captain Marcus increased patrols and began drilling the garrison more intensively. Supplies were quietly stockpiled, and contingency plans were reviewed. But Lord Kael's preparations differed markedly from traditional military responses. Instead of calling for additional troops or reaching out to allies through intimidation, he focused on strengthening the fortress's capacity for self-sufficiency. The healing chambers became even more crucial as he anticipated the need to treat wounded defenders. Maera found herself working more closely with Lord Kael as they planned for scenarios neither wanted to contemplate. "Your skills may prove more valuable than any sword," he told her during one of their evening planning sessions. "An army that can heal its wounded and recover quickly from injury possesses an advantage that most commanders never consider." It was during these intense preparations that their relationship began to shift from formal courtesy to something deeper and more complex. Working side by side in the healing chambers, planning for the defense of their home, they developed an understanding that went beyond words. Maera began to see the man behind the legendary reputation, someone who carried the weight of countless lives on his shoulders, who made difficult decisions with careful consideration rather than brutal impulse. His gentleness with injured animals, his patience with frustrated subordinates, his genuine concern for every person under his protection revealed a character far removed from the stories told about the feared alpha. For his part, Lord Kael seemed to find in Maera not just a healer, but a partner whose insights and perspectives complemented his own. She had a gift for seeing solutions that others missed, for finding ways to turn apparent weaknesses into unexpected strengths. One evening, as they worked together to prepare healing supplies that might be needed in the coming conflict, he spoke words that changed everything between them. "I want you to know," he said, without looking up from the herbs he was grinding, "that whatever happens in the days ahead, bringing you here was the best decision I've made in years." The quiet sincerity in his voice made her hands still in their work. When she looked up, she found him watching her with an expression that held warmth she had never expected to see directed toward her. "My Lord Kael," he corrected gently. "Just Kael. We're past the need for such formality, don't you think?" The use of his given name felt both natural and revolutionary. It marked a crossing of boundaries that had seemed insurmountable when she first arrived at Black Ridge, the distance between master and servant replaced by something approaching equality. "Kael," she repeated, testing the sound of it. "I need you to know that I was dying in that village in ways that had nothing to do with Lord Aldrich's intentions. You didn't just save me from a terrible fate. You gave me a chance to discover who I really am." They were sitting closer now, the pretense of focusing solely on their work abandoned as they acknowledged what had been growing between them for weeks. The pendant around her neck seemed to pulse with warmth, as if responding to the emotional intensity of the moment. "You've become essential to this place," Kael said softly. "To me. I hope you understand that you'll always have a home here, regardless of what titles or roles you choose to claim." The weight of his words settled around them like a blessing. In that moment, Maera realized that somewhere along the way she had stopped thinking of herself as property purchased with gold coins. She had become a partner, a collaborator in building something meaningful and lasting. But their moment of quiet intimacy was interrupted by the sound. of running footsteps in the corridor outside. Captain Marcus appeared in the doorway, his face flushed with exertion and urgency. "My lord," he gasped, struggling to catch his breath. Riders approaching under a flag of truce. Lord Rowan himself, with a small escort. Kael was on his feet instantly, his military training taking precedence over personal considerations. How long until they reached the gates? Perhaps an hour. "My lord, they're moving slowly, as if they want to be seen approaching." "Gather the senior staff in the great hall," Kael commanded, "and send word to the gatehouse. They are to be received with full honors, but kept under careful watch." As Marcus hurried away to carry out his orders, Kael turned back to Maera with an expression that mixed regret and determination. "It seems our enemies have decided to make the first move," he said. "Whatever Lord Rowan wants, I doubt it bodes well for the peace we've been building here." Maera felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. The growing threat that had lurked in the background for weeks was about to become immediate and unavoidable. The question was whether their unconventional preparations would prove sufficient for whatever challenge Lord Rowan intended to present. The pendant grew warm against her skin, and she found herself wondering if her newfound abilities would be tested in ways she had never imagined. The thought was terrifying and oddly exhilarating at the same time. Whatever came next, she would face it standing beside Kael, no longer as his property or even his subordinate, but as his partner in defending the sanctuary they had begun to build together. Lord Rowan arrived at Black Ridge with the calculated precision of a man who understood the power of presentation. His escort was small, but elite 6 mounted warriors whose equipment and bearing spoke of wealth and professional competence. The Lord himself was a figure from the old school of nobility, tall and silver-haired, carrying himself with the absolute confidence of someone who had never seriously doubted his own authority. Kael received his uninvited guests in the great hall, flanked by Captain Marcus and his senior officers. Maera watched from the gallery above, positioned where she could observe without being immediately noticed. She had argued for the right to attend, but Kael had insisted that her safety took precedence over her curiosity. "Lord Kael," Rowan began, after the minimal courtesies had been observed, "I come bearing concerns shared by many of your neighbors and former allies." "Concerns?" Kael's tone was neutral, giving nothing away. "About the changes in your leadership style, the softening that has been observed in recent months." Rowan's pale eyes swept the hall, taking note of details that seemed to confirm his suspicions. A fortress should be a symbol of strength, not a sanctuary for the weak. From her hidden vantage point, Maera could see the tension in Kael's shoulders, the careful control he was exerting to maintain diplomatic courtesy. She knew him well enough now to recognize the signs of barely restrained anger. "I fail to see how the internal management of Black Ridge concerns lords who have no authority." "Here," Kael replied evenly. But you see, it does concern us," Rowan continued, his smile cold and predatory. "When a wolf decides to become a shepherd, the other wolves must consider whether the pack has been compromised." Captain Marcus shifted slightly, his hand moving consciously toward his sword hilt. The comparison was deliberately insulting, designed to provoke exactly such a reaction. But Kael remained motionless, waiting for Rowan to reveal his true purpose. "I propose a simple test," Rowan announced, producing a scroll from within his traveling cloak. "A formal challenge, as is traditional among our people when leadership is questioned. Single combat between champions, with the outcome determining the validity of competing claims." "I have made no claims that require validation," Kael pointed out. "Have you not?" Rowan's smile widened. "By abandoning the traditional ways, by showing mercy where strength is required, by elevating servants above their proper station, you have implicitly claimed that the old ways are wrong. That challenges all of us who maintain proper order." Maera felt her blood chill as she realized the true scope of what was happening. This wasn't simply about local politics or territorial disputes. Lord Rowan was positioning himself as the defender of traditional hierarchy against Kael's revolutionary approach to leadership. The challenge would serve as a public test of which philosophy deserved to prevail. "And if I refuse your challenge?" Kael asked. "Then we will know that the Alpha of Black Ridge has indeed lost his edge," Rowan replied. "And the coalition of lords who share my concerns will be forced to take more direct action to protect the stability of the region." The threat was clear and unmistakable. Accept the challenge and risk everything on the outcome of single combat, or face a coordinated attack by multiple enemies who would claim justification in restoring proper order. But then Lord Rowan played what he clearly believed to be his winning card. Of course, to ensure the legitimacy of the proceedings, the challenge must involve a true test of the competing philosophies. "I propose that the combat take place not between professional warriors, but between representatives of our respective approaches to governance." He turned to look directly at the gallery where Maera was hidden, his smile becoming openly cruel. "I'm told you've elevated a purchased servant to a position of responsibility. Let her serve as your champion. My champion will be Sir Garrett, a knight who has served my family for 20 years. The great hall erupted in shocked murmurs as the full audacity of Rowan's proposal became clear. He was demanding that Maera, untrained in combat, equipped only with her healing abilities, face a seasoned warrior in mortal combat. It was not just a challenge, but a calculated humiliation, designed to expose the supposed folly of Kael's unconventional methods. Kael's voice, when it came, carried a dangerous edge that made even his own men step back. "You suggest that I send an untrained woman to face your knight in single combat? I suggest that you test whether your new philosophy produces warriors worthy of the name," Rowan replied smoothly. "Unless, of course, you admit that traditional strength remains superior to your experiments in mercy and elevation." Maera felt the ancient ward stone's presence before she saw it, a massive boulder embedded in the wall behind Kael's chair that seemed to pulse with awakening power. She had noticed it before, but assumed it was merely decorative, an impressive piece of masonry. That added to the hall's imposing atmosphere now, as emotions ran high and the very foundations of Kael's leadership were challenged. The stone began to emit a faint golden glow that was visible only to her eyes. The pendant around her neck grew warm in response, and she felt something stirring deep within her consciousness, a knowledge that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her own experience. The ward stone was ancient, older than the fortress itself. It had been placed there by the original guardians of the mountain, people who understood that true power came not from conquest but from harmony with the natural forces that shaped the world. For centuries it had slept, waiting for someone with the proper bloodline and abilities to awaken its protective influence. And somehow, impossibly, that someone was her dot as understanding flooded through her. Maera realized that Lord Rowan's challenge had revealed far more than he intended. Her connection to the healing arts wasn't simply a talent for herbalism. It was part of a much larger inheritance that linked her to the ancient magic that had once protected these mountains. She rose from her hidden position and walked calmly down the stairs into the great hall, ignoring the gasps of surprise from Rowan's men and the concerned expressions of Kael's officers. The pendant blazed with inner light as she approached the center of the room, and the ward stone's glow intensified in response to her proximity. "I accept your challenge," she announced, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent hall. "But I propose different terms." Lord Rowan's confident expression faltered as he took in the sight of the glowing pendant and the responding illumination from the ancient stone. "What trickery is this?" "No trickery," Maera replied calmly. "Simply the awakening of powers that have slept in these mountains for far too long. You speak of testing philosophies. Very well. Let your champion face not just me, but the ancient." magic that protects this land and its people. The ward stone pulsed brighter, and cracks of golden light began to spread through the walls of the great hall. Power flowed through the fortress like water through dry earth, awakening defenses that had been dormant for generations. Windows blazed with protective light, and the very stones seemed to sing with renewed purpose. Kael stared at her in amazement, finally understanding why his grandmother's pendant had chosen her, why the healing chambers had responded so dramatically to her presence. She wasn't simply a girl with a gift for herbs. She was the descendant of the ancient guardians, the one prophesied to return when the mountains faced their greatest threat. "You see," Maera continued, addressing the stunned Lord Rowan, "you assumed that strength must always be measured by the sword, that power flows only from fear and dominance. But there are older powers in this world, deeper sources of strength that come from protection rather than conquest." The ward stone's light reached a crescendo, and suddenly the great hall was filled with translucent figures, the spirits of the ancient guardians who had once protected these lands. They stood in silent testimony to a time when strength was measured by wisdom, when leadership meant service rather than domination. Lord Rowan's men backed toward the doors, their hands on their weapons, but clearly uncertain how to fight enemies made of light and memory. Their lord stood frozen, his worldview crumbling as he confronted evidence of powers that existed entirely outside his understanding of how the world worked. "The challenge stands," Maera declared, her voice now carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate from the stone itself. "But the terms are these. Let your philosophy of dominance face the ancient ways of protection. Let your champion face one who fights not for conquest but for sanctuary." As the spirits faded and the ward stone's glow settled into a steady warmth, Maera felt the full weight of her inheritance settling around her like a mantle. She was no longer the frightened girl who had been sold in Thorndale Square. She was the guardian of the mountain, awakened at last to claim her birthright and defend her people. The game had changed completely, and Lord Rowan was beginning to realize that he had walked into a trap far more sophisticated than anything he had imagined possible. The transformation of Black Ridge in the wake of Maera's awakening was nothing short of miraculous. What had been an impressive but conventional fortress became something entirely new, a stronghold infused with ancient magic that responded to her presence like a living thing. Walls that had stood for centuries now hummed with protective energy, and every stone seemed to pulse with renewed purpose. Lord Rowan had departed the next morning with his escort, visibly shaken by what he had witnessed, but too proud to abandon his challenge entirely. The single combat would take place in 3 days' time, he declared, allowing word to spread throughout the region. He clearly hoped that other lords would witness what he assumed would be Maera's inevitable defeat, serving as proof that traditional military might remain superior to whatever sorcery protected Black Ridge. But Maera's herb pouch, which had once contained simple healing supplies, now served as something far more significant. The leather satchel had transformed overnight, becoming a repository for magical components that seemed to appear whenever she needed them. Crystals that could store and focus energy, herbs that grew only in places of power, even vials of spring. Water that sparkled with inner light, all materialized as her understanding of her abilities expanded. The pouch itself had become a magical focus, allowing her to channel the mountain's protective energies through familiar objects. A handful of dried lavender could now weave barriers of calming influence, while crushed sage could reveal hidden truths or dispel illusions. The transformation of common herbs into tools of power symbolized her own journey from outcast to guardian. "You understand what accepting this challenge means?" Kael asked as they stood together in the great hall, watching servants prepare for the coming confrontation. His concern was evident despite his attempts to maintain composure. "Better than I did 3 days ago," Maera replied, touching the pendant that now blazed with constant inner light. "This was never about me proving myself as a warrior. It's about demonstrating that protection can be as powerful as aggression, that there are other ways to win besides destroying your enemies. The fortress inhabitants had responded to her awakening with a mixture of awe and fierce loyalty. Word had spread quickly through the mountain communities, and people began arriving at Black Ridge seeking shelter and guidance. They came as refugees, from harsh lords, as outcasts from rigid societies, as anyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. Captain Marcus supervised the practical preparations with his usual efficiency, but even he seemed affected by the changes around him. "I've served in many fortresses," he confided to Maera during one of their planning sessions, "but I've never seen a place where the very stones seemed to care about the people living within them." It was true. The fortress had become more than defensive architecture. It had become a living sanctuary that responded to the needs of its inhabitants. Rooms grew warmer when children were cold. Passages lit themselves when people walked through them at night, and the kitchens seemed to produce more food than should have been possible from the supplies available. The healing chambers had undergone the most dramatic transformation of all. What had been impressive facilities now pulsed with power that allowed Maera to treat ailments that should have been beyond any healer's ability. Broken bones mended in days rather than months. Fevers broke almost instantly, and even old injuries that had plagued people for years began to heal. "The magic isn't mine alone," she explained to a gathering of refugees who had sought her help. "It flows through this place because it was built with love and care, because everyone here is treated with dignity and respect." The mountain responds to that kind of strength. But the approaching confrontation cast a shadow over these miraculous developments. Sir Garrett, Lord Rowan's champion, was everything that Maera was not: a professional warrior trained from childhood in the arts of combat, equipped with the finest armor and weapons that wealth could provide. He had fought in tournaments and battles, killed men in honest combat, and never known defeat at the hands of anyone he considered a worthy opponent. Maera, by contrast, had never held a sword in anger, had no training in martial combat, and possessed no experience with violence beyond treating its aftermath in the healing chambers. By every conventional measure, the coming fight should be no contest at all. Yet as she spent her days in preparation, guided by instincts that seemed to come from her awakened heritage, Maera began to understand that the challenge would not be won through conventional means. The spirits of the ancient guardians visited her in dreams, sharing knowledge that had been passed down through generations of protectors who had faced similar threats. "Strength has many forms," the ghostly figure of her ancestor whispered during one such vision. "A river can carve canyons through solid rock, not through force, but through persistence and patience. A healer's touch can accomplish what no sword can achieve: the preservation of life rather than its destruction." Kael spent increasing amounts of time with her as the day of challenge approached, their relationship deepening beyond mere partnership into something that approached true intimacy. The revelation of her magical abilities had removed the last barriers between them, allowing them to speak openly about fears and hopes they had never dared voice before. "I was a fool to think I could protect you from this," he admitted during one of their evening walks through the transformed fortress. "You were never meant to hide behind walls or depend on others for your safety. You were meant to be the wall that others shelter behind." "We protect each other," Maera corrected gently. "That's what makes us stronger than anything Lord Rowan and his allies can bring against us. They see strength as something you take from others, but we've learned it's something you build together." The night before the challenge, they held council with all the senior members of the fortress community. Captain Marcus reported that scouts had observed significant movement throughout the region, lords and their retinues converging on Black Ridge to witness what they assumed would be a spectacle of traditional dominance over newfangled idealism. "They expect to see you humiliated," Marcus said bluntly to Maera. to watch Sir Garrett defeat you quickly and decisively, proving that Lord Kael's methods produce weakness rather than strength. Then they'll be disappointed," she replied with a confidence that surprised even herself. "Tomorrow they'll learn that there are forms of power they never imagined possible." The herb pouch at her side pulsed with gentle warmth, filled now with components that existed at the intersection of magic and nature. Each item had been carefully selected not for its ability to harm, but for its power to protect and preserve. She would face Sir Garrett armed not with sword and shield, but with the ancient wisdom of those who had understood that true victory came through creation rather than destruction. As the fortress settled into an uneasy quiet, Maera stood at her window looking out over the mountain landscape that had become her domain. Tomorrow would test everything she had learned about herself, everything she had become since leaving her father's house. The frightened girl who had been sold like livestock was gone forever, replaced by someone she was still learning to understand. The pendant around her neck blazed with steady light, and she could feel the ward stone's power flowing through the fortress like a heartbeat. Whatever happened in the morning, she would face it as the true guardian of Black Ridge, protector of all who sought sanctuary within these ancient walls. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. For the first time in her life, she was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do. That knowledge would have to be armor enough for whatever Sir Garrett brought against her. Dawn broke over Black Ridge with unusual clarity, as if the mountain itself had swept away clouds and mist to ensure perfect visibility for the confrontation to come. By the time the sun reached its zenith, more than a dozen lords had arrived, with their retinues creating a temporary city of pavilions and banners in the valley below the fortress. The crown of thorns appeared during Maera's final preparations, materializing from the mountain vines that grew along the fortress walls. She first noticed it when Maera gasped and pointed toward the window, where tendrils of hardy mountain growth had somehow woven themselves into a circlet of perfect symmetry. The thorns were small but sharp, interspersed with tiny flowers that seemed to glow with their own inner light. "It's a sign," Maera whispered, her voice filled with awe. "The mountain itself recognizes you as its guardian." When Maera lifted the crown from the windowsill, it felt warm against her palms and perfectly weighted, as if it had been crafted specifically for her head. The moment she placed it upon her brow, power flowed through her like lightning through wire, not painful but intense, awakening every magical sense she possessed to extraordinary clarity. The challenge ground had been prepared in the valley's center, a circle of packed earth large enough to allow for proper combat while ensuring that spectators could observe from a safe distance. Lord Rowan's pavilion dominated the western side, its crimson banners snapping in the mountain wind, while Kael had positioned his much smaller contingent opposite. Sir Garrett cut an impressive figure as he entered the circle, his polished armor reflecting the afternoon sunlight like a mirror. He moved with the fluid grace of a man who had devoted his entire life to the mastery of combat, each step calculated for maximum efficiency and intimidation. His sword was a work of art, as much as a weapon perfectly balanced steel, with a hilt wrapped in gold wire that spoke of countless victories. When Maera appeared at the circle's edge, a murmur ran through the assembled crowd. Many had heard rumors of her transformation, but seeing her in person was something else entirely. The crown of thorns marked her as something beyond ordinary human authority, while the blazing pendant and transformed herb pouch clearly identified her as a practitioner of arts most nobles preferred to dismiss as peasant superstition. "You still have time to withdraw this farce," Lord Rowan called out as the combatants took their positions. "No one need die today to prove that traditional strength remains supreme. The only farce here is your belief that strength can only be measured by the sword," Maera replied, her voice carrying clearly across the valley. "Today, you'll learn there are older powers than those you serve." Sir Garrett saluted her with professional courtesy, though his expression remained confident to the point of smugness. He had faced wizards before in his career, and found them wanting once separated from their towers and libraries. Whatever hedge magic this peasant girl commanded, it would prove insufficient against 3 decades of combat experience. The formal challenge began with the traditional recitation of terms and conditions, but Maera barely heard the words. Her attention was focused inward on the flow of power that connected her to the mountain, to the fortress, to every living thing that sheltered under her protection. The crown of thorns seemed to focus that energy, allowing her to perceive the battlefield on levels that transcended ordinary sight. When the signal came to begin, Sir Garrett moved with deadly efficiency, his sword cutting through the air in patterns designed to overwhelm and intimidate. His opening assault was textbook perfect, a combination of strikes that would force most opponents into purely defensive reactions while he assessed their capabilities and weaknesses. But Maera didn't react in any way he had anticipated. Instead of retreating or attempting to parry attacks she had no hope of blocking, she stepped forward into his range, her hands moving in intricate patterns that drew power from her herb pouch and channeled it through gestures that seemed to bend reality. Around them. Where his sword should have found flesh, it met barriers of crystallized air that turned aside even his most powerful strikes. The watching lords shifted uneasily as they witnessed combat unlike anything in their experience. This wasn't the clash of steel against steel they had come to observe, but something that challenged their fundamental understanding of how battles were won and lost. Sir Garrett's confidence began to erode as strike after strike failed to connect with his elusive target. Worse, he could feel something draining his strength with each attempted blow, not fatigue in the ordinary sense, but a deeper exhaustion that seemed to sap his will to continue fighting. What sorcery is this? He demanded, backing away to reassess his approach. No sorcery, Maera replied calmly, the crown of thorns blazing with inner light. Simply the proper application of protective arts. You seek to destroy, while I seek to preserve. Guess which the mountain favors. As if in response to her words, the ground beneath their feet began to glow with the same golden radiance that had transformed the fortress. Power flowed up through the earth, through her feet, through every fiber of her being, until she felt as though she had become a conduit for forces far greater than any individual could command. The transformation was visible to every observer. Where before they had seen a young woman facing impossible odds, now they witnessed something that transcended ordinary human limitations. A guardian chosen and empowered by the very land itself. Sir Garrett's second assault was more desperate than skillful, driven by growing panic as he realized that nothing in his experience had prepared him for this kind of confrontation. His blade, which had never failed him before, seemed to grow heavier with each swing, while his armor felt increasingly restrictive rather than protective. The turning point came when Sir Garrett, driven by desperation and disbelief, abandoned all pretense of chivalric combat and launched himself at Maera with murderous intent. His sword, raised high above his head, blazed with reflected sunlight as he brought it down, and the strike meant to cleave her from crown to waist. The treaty seal materialized in Maera's hands at the moment of greatest danger, a disk of golden light that expanded into a shield capable of turning aside even the most powerful blow. But more than defense, it represented the magic's true purpose, the binding of agreements made in good faith, the enforcement of justice, and the protection of those who chose cooperation over conquest. Sir Garrett's blade struck the shield with force that should have shattered stone, but instead of breaking through, the impact sent ripples of golden energy radiating outward in all directions. Where those ripples touched the watching lords, they felt something they had never experienced before, a direct understanding of the suffering their traditional methods had caused, the pain of those who had been broken by systems that valued strength above all else. For a brief, crystalline moment, every observer in the valley experienced what it felt like to be powerless in the face of overwhelming force. They felt the fear of the weak, the desperation of the hungry, the hopelessness of those who had been dismissed as worthless. The emotional impact was devastating, leaving grown men weeping openly as they confronted the true cost of their philosophy. But the seal's power reached beyond mere emotional revelation. As it expanded, it began to weave visible bonds between Maera and everyone present, threads of golden light that connected heart to heart, creating a web of understanding that transcended traditional hierarchies. You see? Maera's voice carried across the stunned silence that followed. This is what real strength looks like. Not the power to destroy, but the ability to understand, to protect, to build something better than what came before. Sir Garrett stood frozen, his sword still pressed against the golden shield, but his face showed the same transformation that had overcome the watching lords. The magical revelation had stripped away years of conditioning, allowing him to see clearly for perhaps the first time in his adult life. "I yield," he whispered, then louder. "I yield to the guardian of Black Ridge." As he stepped back and lowered his weapon, the treaty seal expanded further, encompassing the entire valley in its radiant embrace. But this was no forced surrender. Instead, it offered something far more powerful: the opportunity for genuine change, for a new understanding of what strength could mean. Lord Rowan, his face pale with shock and something approaching terror, tried to protest. "This is witchcraft, not honest combat. No agreement made under such influence can be considered binding." But his words fell on deaf ears as one by one, the assembled lords began to kneel. They had felt the weight of their choices, understood the consequences of their actions, and recognized that Maera offered them something they had never dared hope for: a chance at redemption. The golden seal continued to expand until it covered the entire region, binding not just the assembled nobles, but everyone within the mountain's influence under a new compact. This was no treaty written on parchment, but a magical agreement inscribed directly on the hearts of all who accepted it. "The terms are simple," Maera announced, her voice carrying with supernatural clarity to every person present. "Protection for all who seek it, regardless of birth or station. Justice based on compassion rather than revenge. Strength measured by what we build together rather than what we tear down." The crown of thorns blazed with triumphant light as the transformation completed itself. Black Ridge Fortress stood no longer as merely the stronghold of a single lord, but as the capital of a new kind of kingdom, one built on principles that most had considered impossibly idealistic. As the magical energies settled and the golden light faded to a warm glow that would permanently mark the transformed region, Maera felt the full weight of what had been accomplished. The frightened girl sold by her father was truly gone, replaced by someone capable of changing the world. Through the simple act of refusing to accept that suffering was inevitable, Kael approached across the challenge ground, his face showing a mixture of pride, amazement, and something deeper that needed no words to communicate. When he knelt before her, it was not in submission but in acknowledgement of what she had become, not his possession or even his partner, but his equal in every way that mattered. "The guardian of Black Ridge," he said formally, then rose and smiled with an expression that transformed his scarred features. "My lady, my love, my co-ruler in this new kingdom we've built together." The assembled lords began to disperse, but not in defeat. Many lingered to speak with Maera personally, seeking guidance on how to transform their own holdings according to the principles she had demonstrated. The magical revelation had shown them possibilities they had never imagined, and they were eager to learn how to implement similar changes in their own territories. Even Lord Rowan, though clearly shaken by the day's events, approached with something resembling humility. "I came here expecting to witness the defeat of dangerous idealism," he admitted. "Instead, I find myself wondering if perhaps the dangerous thing was my own certainty about how the world must work. Change is always possible, Maera replied gently. It simply requires the courage to admit that our old ways might not have been serving everyone as well as we believed. As the sun began to set behind the mountain peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Maera stood with Kael looking out over the valley where their new kingdom had been born. The treaty seal's magic continued to pulse gently through the land, a permanent reminder that strength could take many forms, and that true victory lay not in conquest but in the creation of something worth protecting. 5 years had passed since the day that transformed the mountain kingdoms, and the world had become something unrecognizable to those who remembered the old ways. What began as a single fortress dedicated to sanctuary had grown into a network of communities stretching across half the continent, all bound together by the principles Maera had demonstrated on that fateful afternoon. The memory crystal sat in the place of honor in Black Ridge's great hall, a faceted gem the size of a man's fist that pulsed with soft light. Unlike the other artifacts that had marked Maera's journey, this one had appeared gradually, growing over the years as stories and experiences accumulated within its crystalline structure. It served as both record and inspiration, preserving the tale of transformation for future generations who might need reminding that change was always possible. Inside the crystal, scenes played like captured dreams, the frightened girl standing on Thorndale's punishment block, the moment of awakening when ancient power stirred to life, the golden light that had bound former enemies in understanding and compassion. But more than preserving the past, the crystal looked forward, showing glimpses of a future where strength and gentleness were not opposites but partners in building something better than what had come before. Maera stood before the great windows of the transformed fortress, watching the morning activities in the courtyard below. Children played games that would have been unthinkable 5 years ago, noble-born and peasant together, without regard for the artificial divisions that had once seemed so important. Their laughter rose like music, blending with the sounds of productive work and peaceful conversation that filled every corner of the sanctuary. "Do you ever miss the simplicity of it?" Kael asked, joining her at the window. His own transformation over the years had been as remarkable as any other change. In their kingdom, the scarred warrior had become something new, still formidable when protection was needed, but primarily a builder of peace rather than a wielder of violence. "The simplicity of what?" she replied, though she knew what he meant. "When our biggest concern was whether you could learn to prepare healing drafts," he said with gentle humor, "before we had to worry about grain distribution across 12 provinces, or mediating disputes between reformed lords who were still learning how to govern with compassion." Maera smiled, understanding his wistfulness even as she rejected the sentiment behind it. Those weren't simpler times. They were times when we didn't yet understand how much work real change requires. "I prefer the complexity. It means we're actually accomplishing something meaningful." Through the window, they could see one of the teaching gardens where former outcasts now instructed the children of nobility and arts that had once been dismissed as peasant skills. The sight never failed to move her young people, learning that knowledge had value regardless of its source, that wisdom could be found in the most unexpected places. The transformation hadn't been without its challenges. Some lords had proven incapable of genuine change, despite the magical revelation of the treaty seal. Others had tried to exploit the new systems for personal gain, assuming that compassion meant weakness or that mercy could be mistaken for foolishness. But the network of connected communities had proven remarkably resilient. When problems arose in one area, others provided support and guidance. When old patterns threatened to reassert themselves, the shared commitment to better principles held firm. One of the most remarkable changes had been the return of her father. Gareth had arrived at Black Ridge 6 months after the Great Challenge, traveling in a merchant's wagon with nothing but the clothes on his back and expression of desperate hope. The gold Lord Kael had paid for her freedom was gone, lost to the same gambling addiction that had destroyed his previous life. But losing the money had also broken the cycle of denial that had trapped him for years. "I don't expect forgiveness," he had told her during their first conversation. "I sold my own daughter like livestock. There's no excuse for that, no justification that makes it acceptable." The conversation that followed had been one of the most difficult of Maera's life. Years of hurt and resentment warred with the understanding that her father was himself a victim of circumstances and choices that had spiraled beyond his control. The magical awakening that had made her the guardian of Black Ridge had also given her the wisdom to see patterns of pain that extended far beyond individual responsibility. "Forgiveness isn't something you earn," she had told him finally. "It's something I choose to give because carrying anger hurts me more than it hurts you. But if you stay here, if you want to be part of what we're building, you'll need to prove that you've truly changed." The proving had taken years. Gareth worked in the stables, tended gardens, helped with construction projects, and slowly rebuilt relationships that addiction had destroyed. He attended meetings for those struggling with similar problems, sharing his story as a warning and offering hope to others who felt trapped by their own poor choices. The day he asked permission to marry widow Elena, whose husband had died in one of the old wars of conquest, Maera realized that her father had indeed become someone different. Not someone seeking to reclaim his former status or erase his mistakes, but someone committed to building something better from the ruins of what he had lost. "She makes me want to be worthy of the life I'd been given," he had said simply. "I can't undo what I did to you, but I can try to honor the second chance you've given me." The wedding had been a quiet affair, but one that marked an important milestone in the ongoing work of transformation. Even the most damaged relationships could heal, given time and genuine commitment to change. Now, watching from her window as Elena's grandchildren played with other children in the courtyard, Maera marveled at how completely their world had been remade. The fortress that had once stood as a symbol of military might now serve as the heart of a kingdom, built on entirely different principles. The healing chambers had expanded into a teaching hospital, where students from across the known world came to learn arts that combined ancient wisdom with magical innovation. The gardens provided not just food and medicine for the fortress, but seeds and knowledge that spread throughout the allied communities. Most importantly, the Great Hall no longer served primarily as a place for receiving tribute or planning military campaigns. Instead, it hosted councils where problems were solved through collaboration rather than decree, where the voices of farmers carried as much weight as those of former nobles. "The delegation from the eastern reaches arrives tomorrow," Kael reminded her, consulting the ever-present correspondence that marked his responsibilities as co-ruler of their expanding kingdom. "Lord Marcus's transformation has been remarkable," Maera replied. 6 months ago, he was preparing to invade his neighbors to settle a water rights dispute. Now, he's asking for guidance on how to negotiate a sharing agreement that benefits everyone involved. "The crystal's influence extends further each month," Kael observed, glancing toward the memory crystal that pulsed with gentle light. "People are remembering that cooperation usually achieves more than conflict." The artifact had become central to their governance in ways neither had anticipated. When facing difficult decisions, they could consult the stored wisdom of countless previous situations, learning from successes and failures across the entire network of allied communities. But more than that, the crystal served as a reminder of core principles that remained constant even as specific circumstances changed. As the afternoon wore on, Maera made her usual rounds through the fortress and its surrounding communities. She visited the healing halls where former enemies now worked side by side to ease suffering. She stopped by the workshops where weapons were transformed into tools of construction rather than destruction. She paused at the schools where children learned that their worth was measured by kindness and wisdom rather than birth and wealth. Each interaction reminded her of how far they had all traveled from the dark morning when her father had dragged her to Thorndale's punishment block. The girl who had expected nothing but humiliation and suffering had become someone capable of reshaping the world through the simple conviction that everyone deserved dignity and protection. But perhaps the most important change was the one she saw in herself. The fear and shame that had defined her early years were gone, replaced by confidence rooted not in magical power, but in the knowledge that she was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do. As evening approached, and memory crystal's light brightened in response to the gathering darkness, Maera stood once again at the great windows with Kael beside her. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that strength and compassion could work together to build something better than what had come before. No regrets? Kael asked, echoing a question that had become a ritual between them. None, she replied, her hand finding his as they watched their people settle into another peaceful evening. We've built something worth protecting, something worth fighting for. That's more than most people can say about their lives. The memory crystal pulsed with warm light, recording another day in the ongoing story of transformation that had begun with an act of rescue disguised as a transaction. In its depths, future generations would find proof that the world could change, that ancient patterns of dominance and submission were not inevitable, that strength came in many forms, and in the center of it all, two souls who had found each other across the gulf of their different origins continued the work of building a kingdom where everyone could discover their hidden strengths and claim their rightful place in the community of those who chose protection over conquest, understanding over judgment, and love over fear.